She's real fine, my 409. She's real fine, my 409. Boy, that's pretty tough to emulate the Beach Boys there. And no, don't touch your dial. That was not AI. That is why you love this channel. But today we are going to talk about the 1964 Impala SS, the first year that the SS was actually its own model as opposed to just an option package. And this particular 1964 Impala SS 409. Now, the 1964 Impala has become one of the Chevrolets in history that's perhaps most well known, and that owes a lot to hip-hop culture, where for whatever reason, a number of hip-hop songs have been authored about this particular Impala, or it's been featured in music videos. And I have to say it's a good-looking car, although I do prefer the 1965 Impala more, admittedly. This one still is good looking. Now, 1964 was the last year of this body style, and as I mentioned, Chevrolet introduced the SS as its own model line for 1964, and the so-called Jet Smooth Ride was what you got with your Impala. Of course, everything was jet-related. It had, I guess, evolved from rockets in the late 50s to jets at this point. And as we take a look here at the front end of the 64 Impala, you'll see as we rotate around the car that the front end on this car is pretty flat. It doesn't have a lot of dimension. After the 1963 model had a bit more pointiness to the front end, this one was toned down pretty significantly. And I would say the car was more rounded overall. Still a great looker. But again, for me, the 65 is my favorite. Now you have an interesting treatment here. You have the wall-to-wall grille that spills out around the headlamps, and you kind of have a mini dog bone barbell theme where the trim above the headlamps kind of expands and gets taller than the trim above the grille in the midsection of the car. So that was something that would become increasingly popular as the 1960s would go on, and you'd see the sheet metal, the fenders, or the hood kind of bulge upward to align with the trim. Here, that doesn't happen. You have the fender peaks, but you pretty much then, outside of the fender peaks, have a relatively flat hood. Although you did get the wind split molding and the crease running down the midsection there. Now, I will say that the bumper on this is pretty nicely integrated, and you got a lot of bright work on the front end, not a lot of body color, just a lot of shiny parts, and very dainty bumper guards. I don't think that this bumper is going to serve let's say, its true function very well. And I will say, at least it looks good. Now, as we rotate around to the front three-quarter view, notice, like I was saying, that front end is pretty flat here. Almost looks like it ran into a wall. But I still think it's a good-looking front end. And take a look at the fender form here. This is an extremely complicated fender and has a lot of surfacing. Take a look, as an example, ahead of the front wheel. You have the fender kind of curling inward, and then this little cove section where the bumper interfaces. And notice that behind the wheel, you don't have a similar surface. You do have this little shoulder and a crease, or this little bulge coming out on the lower section of the fender that continues all the way rearward. Notice it's also creating some really interesting shadows, and different shadows from the surface that's ahead of the front wheel. You can see the shadows there, and also the shadows underneath that surface that runs the full length of the car. Just beautiful surfacing on this car overall. The 1964 Impala was the last Impala that was designed by Claire McKeegan, who had been Chevrolet's chief designer from about 1953 through 1962 before it would be handed over to Irv Ribicki. So any of those Chevrolets during that time period were really the work of one individual. Now, before we transition to the side view, one of the things I'll point out is look at how flat the belt line is on this car. And it has a fender peak that kind of fades away as it gets to the door. And then as you go rearward, you have this kind of flat plane around the entire car and a shoulder that is outboard of the glass plane. So it's kind of an interestingly styled car, and we'll see that as we go on to the side view, just how flat the belt line is. And here you go. You can clearly see it's quite flat. Pretty unusual for a GM car. It doesn't really have much of a taper in the front to rear. The deck lid tapers a little bit, but certainly the quarter panel really doesn't all that much. Now, the other interesting thing here is that if you look at the quarter panel, look at the rear end, and you see this cove that is kind of scalloped out where the Impala logo is, and it says Impala on the back of the rear quarter. And then if you look as that cove kind of goes forward, it just fades out into nothing. I thought that was a really cool detail and just speaks to the surfacing that GM's designers really executed during this era. I also love how if you look at, there's almost like this torpedo-like form on the lower, and notice how it gets fatter and fatter as it goes rearward, starting at the front wheel where it connects to the wheel arch. Then it gets fatter and fatter. It kind of goes over the rear wheel. But as it goes to the back, it just gets larger and larger. And notice how it's casting a shadow on the underside of it. So you have the highlight that kind of comes through with the form itself, on the top side of the form, and then you have the low light on the underside. So this is pretty dramatically styled, and it's pretty amazing because this also is a non-metallic paint car. If this were a metallic paint car, you'd even see the surfacing in a more pronounced fashion. And one last detail from this view, you'll notice that the roof has kind of a kink in it around the rear quarter glass and then a pretty distinctive crease near the backlight. This car has the faux carriage bow kind of roof that was a styling fad during this era where you'd see these carriage bows in the back to kind of make it look like it was a convertible. And I don't know if they did that because this was a hardtop coupe and they wanted to give it that look of a convertible, but that was something, like I said, that was pretty popular during this era. Now, from this view, you can also see the carriage bows in the roof, but you more importantly can see that cove that I was talking about where the block lettering spelling out Impala and the logo, the SS logo there, is kind of inset into it. Notice how it just beautifully fades as it goes forward, and notice how dark the shadow is as you move rearward on the car. Just a wonderful detail. We'll get around to the rear end in a moment, but certainly a very finely detailed rear end. Look at the tail lamps and how they're flanked with all this bright work, kind of two rings, concentric rings of bright work. And then you've got the somewhat diminutive bumper guards again, and this inverted U-shaped piece of bright work around the back that, let's take a look at the back now. And here you have it. Talk about a detailed rear end. You have, of course, the triple tail lamp theme that was introduced with the 58 Impala for the first time on Chevrolets, and that would be pervasive for many years. You've got a very flat deck lid, relatively flat quarters, not much taper to the deck lid either, as I mentioned before. And when you look at it from this dead-on rear view, it certainly looks wide because it's so flat. And also because notice how the C-pillars are pulled in a little bit away from the outer edge of the body. So it makes the rear view, when you're just staring at it from this angle, look even wider. Of course, that kind of inverted U shape is also helping and complemented by the Chevrolet block lettering. And even the logo has this horizontal orientation to it. Of course, you have the little Chevrolet logo in blue in the middle, but then you have almost a little bit like a Cadillac form that's spread out with a different aspect ratio. And again, accentuating the width. The three tail lamps also help with that. Even the bumper, you have this rib theme in the midsection of it, and the license plate just very nicely set in there. And of course, you've got a molding down the middle of the deck lid, very similar to up front how you had the wind split molding. So a lot of detail went into this rear end, maybe arguably even too much detail, but I think it's my favorite part of the car overall. Notice also how you get this slimming look because the top of the deck lid and the quarters is obviously body color, as is the panel that is housing the tail lamps. But because of the way that panel is canted and kind of tucked in underneath that inverted U shape, notice the light is not really hitting it all that well in this particular angle. And as a result, you have this very kind of slimmed look to the rear end because you have that inverted U shape, the bumper, and then this area that's relatively dark. So your eye really just picks up the width of the deck lid and the quarters and kind of misses the visual height. And that, I think, was probably the designer's intention was, again, this was the era of longer, lower, wider, and this car certainly kind of gives that appearance. Although It's not all that long overall. The Chevrolets were the shortest vehicles of the full-size cars across Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, and Cadillac. This car rode atop a 119-inch wheelbase and was just a shade under 210 inches in overall length. As the 1970s would come along, cars would get bigger and bigger, and 210 inches of length would not seem like very much during that time frame. Even during this time frame, if you had the Buick Electra, the Electra was known as the Electra 225 because it was 225 inches in length overall, so over a foot longer than this Impala. Now, as we turn to the interior of this Impala SS, you also notice that the designers put a lot of attention to detail here. Look at the door panel and just how beautiful everything is, from the window cranks to the door actuation handle. You have the SS badge in the middle, pieces of bright work all over. You just don't see this now. If you get a Chevrolet or a lower end car, you basically just have a big piece of plastic. Here, you at least got some pieces of metal and bright work on the door panel that looked really good, along with the engine turning on the dash that came with the SS's. And you also see here you have the Chevrolet kind of Swiss cheese wheel to make you think like you're piloting a racing vehicle. Now, this one is pretty fast. This is a 409 four-speed car. So, I would say that this one would certainly haul the mail. But it wasn't a race car, although I do appreciate what the designers were trying to do with the overall interior theme and the steering wheel there. And as we zoom in a little bit, I love the humorously small tachometer that's in the middle of the IP here, kind of blocking the speedometer a little bit. The speedometer is just this horizontally oriented gauge with the sweeping needle. And the tachometer is kind of similar. Now everything is round dials, but I have to say I kind of miss the speedometers that were like this. I would love to see something that was a little bit different from the modern vehicles. And I think that there's a certain amount of nostalgia and coolness. Not as cool as the rotating drum speedometers, but nonetheless, this is pretty sweet. Now, one other interesting factoid about the 1961 to 65 General Motors full-size cars is that they have this huge deep well trunk that was enabled by the fuel tank placement. This is something that went away on the 1965 to 70 generation, the 1971 to 76, and even the one after that. And Ford kind of kept with the deep well trunk, but GM, for whatever reason, abandoned it and then decided to put the fuel tank down there. So it made it a lot harder to have a trunk like this. Like I said, Ford would have that for many different years. But if you want a GM with a deep well trunk, here you are. Now, turning under hood, this is where this particular vehicle really shines, because in the Impalas, at least across the full range of Impalas, you could get everything from a 140 horsepower, 230 cubic inch six-cylinder up to a 425 horsepower 409. And this baby has the 409 coupled with the four-speed. There actually were three 409s that were offered. There was a 340 horsepower, there was a 400 horsepower, there's a 425 horsepower. The latter two, you had to get a manual transmission, the four-speed manual. 340 horsepower 409, you could get the Power Glide or the four-speed. But aside from the 409s, there was, I mentioned the six-cylinder, there was 195 horsepower 283, there was a 250 horsepower 327, and a 300 horsepower 327. So you really had a wide range of engine and transmission choices in your Impala. But if you wanted the absolute top dog, you got the 425 horsepower 409 coupled with the four-speed manual transmission. And that's what makes some of these Impalas just super rare and super cool. So what do you think of this 1964 Impala SS with the 409 underhood and the four-speed manual transmission? Pretty sweet. Great styling as well. Although, like I said, I like the 65 better, but the 64 is a good-looking vehicle. Which one do you like better? Put a comment in the comment section. Thanks for watching.